There's a kind of silence in remote forests that doesn't feel empty. It feels like something is waiting. It held stillness without breath or motion, yet its presence was undeniable. I'd been waiting too. For 2 years, actually. When the call finally came in that a lookout tower had opened up, I didn't believe it at first. The kind of disbelief that comes when you've forgotten you even applied. It was a federal post. It was a fire watch assignment in the middle of nowhere, and it was precisely the kind of placement I had been hoping for all along. They said it was an easy gig on paper. The job involved long hours of sitting, observing the horizon, and filing reports. But there was a waiting list, and people didn't quit often. When they did, it was usually for a reason. I chose not to dwell on uncertainties or probe for details that might change my decision. Instead, I focused on preparing my belongings, folding each piece of clothing with intention, as if order and readiness could substitute for answers I didn't have. The ranger who picked me up didn't say much. Old Jeep, rust bleeding out from the wheel wells. He wore sunglasses, although the sky was overcast. The silence between us carried no tension, only a sense of detached routine that suggested he had done this countless times before. I got the sense he'd done this a few times. We drove for hours, and the road beneath us began to transform with each passing mile. The smooth blacktop gave way to rough gravel, which then turned to dusty, uneven dirt. Potholes and loose rocks jostled the Jeep as we climbed further into the wilderness. The terrain sloped gently at first, but then began to curve and dip in tight bends, each one cutting deeper into the heart of the forest. Trees grew taller and denser the further we went, their limbs stretching over the road like a canopy, filtering the already muted daylight. The sunlight grew patchy. My cell signal flickered and disappeared somewhere near the second ridge. I kept checking it out of instinct, even though I knew it was useless now. The farther we drove, the more the forest pressed inward, making the road feel narrower, more secluded. It wasn't long before the dirt track became a single-lane path with no shoulder and no visibility beyond the bend ahead. The Jeep's engine rumbled steadily as we pushed forward, and the ranger beside me stayed silent the entire time, his focus on the road unwavering. "Not much up here," he said, voice dry, like leaves in August. "Not many fires either." I nodded, unsure if he expected a reply. We reached a bridge, wooden, old, one of those structures that creaks under weight and shifts just enough to make you doubt it. The Jeep rolled forward slowly. It felt hesitant. "Last guy never came down," the ranger added, his voice flat, almost bored, like he was reading it from a report he no longer cared about. I turned to look at him, hoping for a trace of irony or exaggeration. But he still hadn't taken off his glasses, and the hard set of his jaw didn't shift. "What happened to him?" I asked, trying to sound casual. "Some say he quit. Some say he lost it. Official report says self-inflicted." The words hung in the air longer than I expected. He offered no additional detail and spoke without any trace of gentleness or attempt to cushion the impact. I waited. I thought there'd be more. A shrug. A laugh. Something to let me off the hook. Something to tell me that it was all just ranger folklore meant to spook the new guy. But there was nothing. He kept his eyes on the road and his hands on the wheel. Inside, my stomach twisted subtly, marked by the early sensations of unease that hinted at something deeper taking hold. A kind of tension, the early signs of something uncomfortable starting to stir, an unfamiliar edge of uncertainty that tightened just beneath the surface. Like a warning tap on the shoulder from somewhere deep in the body. Something about the way he said it made it feel less like an anecdote and more like a quiet resignation, as if that ending was common enough to be accepted without surprise. We didn't talk again. When we reached the base of the tower, he killed the engine, got out, and pulled my bag from the back. He set it down next to the wooden stairs. "There's a radio in there. Use it once a day to check in. Supplies get dropped off on Mondays and Thursdays. Don't call for anything else unless it's an actual fire," he said, as if reading from a script he had said too many times before, his tone as worn as the leather on the Jeep's steering wheel. That was all. There was no orientation, no documents handed over, and not a single word spoken about how difficult the solitude might become. The ranger simply recited a few practical instructions and returned to the jeep, driving away without a moment of hesitation or acknowledgement. I stood there a moment longer than I should have, trying to make sense of how casually he had delivered it. Like it was all routine, like nothing more needed to be said. But the way he emphasized the word fire had lodged somewhere deeper than I expected. The tower was tall, metal frame, narrow stairs, wood cabin perched on top. It swayed slightly with the wind. I looked up and saw windows on all sides. The windows were bare, with no curtains or blinds, offering an uninterrupted view through the glass to the dense forest that stretched out endlessly in every direction. I carried my bag up slowly. Each step creaked. At the top, the door was unlocked. The air inside was cold, musty. The place gave off a sense of recent occupation, as if someone had only just left and might return at any moment, yet it lacked any warmth or familiarity that would make it feel lived in. It lingered in a state somewhere between maintenance and neglect, touched by human presence but void of comfort. The first thing I noticed as I stepped further inside was a faint, discolored mark on the wooden floorboards. It was more than a simple scuff or water stain, marked by a darker tone than the surrounding wood, and had an irregular shape, the kind of shape you don't want to interpret. It sat partially under the frayed edge of an old rug, as though someone had tried to cover it hastily, but hadn't committed to the effort. I paused and looked at it for a while. My hand tightened on the strap of my bag. I chose not to step any closer. The room was small but functional. Against the left wall was a single bed with a thin, sagging mattress. A narrow, wood-burning stove stood opposite it, with a metal pipe running up through the ceiling. Next to the stove sat a square desk, battered and worn, with a fixed two-way radio resting on top. A mini fridge hummed near the far corner, the low thrum of its generator barely audible beneath the creak of the tower swaying in the wind. Shelves were built into the far wall, holding a row of aged books. The spines were cracked and several had handwritten names inside, none of which I recognized. I unpacked slowly and methodically. I laid out my phone and charger, a flashlight, 3 worn paperback novels I had picked for the solitude, a pack of crackers, a bag of trail mix, and a metal thermos. These were the essentials I'd brought, kept to a minimum, but just enough to give a shape to the next few days. I arranged them along the desk and took in the room again. When I finally sat down on the bed, the mattress barely gave beneath me. It was firm and lined with an itchy wool blanket. As I leaned back, something rigid pressed sharply into my shoulder blade. I pulled off the pillow and beneath it was a notebook. Its cover was worn smooth from use, the pages yellowed and curling at the edges. As I lifted it, a single folded sheet of paper slipped out and fluttered to the floor. All lookouts must follow these rules while occupying the tower. The note was handwritten, its lines slanted and uneven. I unfolded it carefully. Lights must be off by 10 p.m. Any light beyond this hour may attract unwanted attention. Remain still and do not acknowledge movement beyond the windows. I paused at this one. The phrasing was odd. Unwanted attention didn't sound like bears or poachers. It sounded targeted, like something new to come when the lights stayed on. Supply drops occur on Mondays and Thursdays, but the time is never consistent. Do not approach the crates until no sound remains. If a box is already open, do not touch it. Use the red flare. That made me glance toward the tree line. I tried to imagine who might be responsible for these drops. The warning about sound was more unsettling than the schedule itself. I didn't know what sound it meant. Was it mechanical, like a drone's whirring rotors, or something far more intimate, like the ragged pull of breath just beyond the trees? No visitors are permitted. If anyone knocks, speak through the door. If they mimic your voice, retreat and lock yourself inside until dawn. Mimicry. The word froze something inside me. What had happened to require that level of specificity, and how would something have my voice? Safe combination is 8913. Only open it if every clock in the tower freezes simultaneously. Inside, you will find a silver stopwatch. Wind it once. When it stops, time outside will reset, but you must not be looking at the forest when it does. This one was impossible to digest. Time manipulation, a stopwatch and a safe that could reset reality. What kind of place was this tower? Radio logs must be submitted to HQ by Sunday evening. Do not listen to your own recorded voice if played back unexpectedly. If this occurs, bury the radio unit at least 10 inches into the soil. I instinctively glanced at the radio on the desk. What exactly had the last person heard? Their voice saying something they didn't remember saying? Something worse? Use the emergency phone only to report visible wildfires. If the line connects by itself, hang up without speaking. If the voice insists, cover the receiver with the provided cloth and do not answer again. An emergency line that calls you back. I didn't even want to look at the phone. I made a mental note to check for the cloth. Not answering seemed like a matter of survival. Call your sister station before sleep. If the voice on the other end matches yours precisely, you are not speaking to the station. Do not continue the conversation. This one lingered. I was supposed to hear from someone else each night. But if I heard myself, what kind of game was this? There was no header, no signature. I turned it over. The back of the paper was blank. I pinned it to the fridge with a rusted magnet shaped like a bear. I opened a pack of crackers and sat at the table. Outside, the sun dipped behind the pines, painting the entire forest in a saturated amber light. The view had the kind of richness people traveled miles to find. A postcard serenity that dulled the sharp edge of my unease. I turned on the radio and adjusted the frequency dial until the channel display locked into place. The green indicator glowed faintly. Station 5 on Sentinel Peak. Checking in. Over. The only answer was static, that low, constant hiss that filled the space between transmissions. I leaned in slightly, holding the receiver close, straining to hear even the faintest anomaly in the background noise. Nothing came. I waited for several minutes. The static hummed gently, filling the room like a presence of its own. I repeated the message one more time, slowly, as if the extra care in my tone might somehow yield a different outcome. Still no response. After another long moment, I set the receiver back into its cradle and turned the radio off. The hum stopped. The room felt heavier for it. The silence that followed had a different quality to it now, thicker, more deliberate, like the air itself had begun to listen. I got ready for bed, brushing my teeth with bottled water, changing into a pair of loose sweats, and easing myself onto the stiff mattress that barely compressed beneath me. The ceiling stared back blankly, offering no comfort or distraction. I lay still, feeling the unfamiliar weight of the silence settle around me as I slipped into a heavy, dreamless sleep that felt more like surrender than rest. At some point in the night, I began to dream. In it, I heard footsteps, not abstract or symbolic, but tangible and distinct, as if someone real had climbed the stairs with slow, deliberate intent. Each step creaked upward, drawing closer to the door. I knew they didn't belong to me, and in the dream, I couldn't move. The door opened with a groan that dragged through the air, and I remained frozen, my body ignoring every command to turn, to sit up, to act. I woke to wind pressing against the glass. The windows rattled, gently but persistently, as if they remembered the dream better than I did. By morning, the fog had consumed everything. A dense, unmoving sheet of white pressed against the glass in every direction, obscuring the forest entirely. I made coffee on the old stovetop and stood at the window, holding the mug in both hands for warmth, staring into the shapeless wall beyond. The silence outside was matched by the stillness within. Then something shifted out there. The movement emerged gradually and with intent, carrying a rhythm that didn't resemble the erratic twitch of startled wildlife or the easy flecks of wind through leaves. It flowed with a slow, measured grace, as though the forest had paused to take a breath, holding itself in place to observe me. I narrowed my eyes and focused, and through a thinning patch of fog, I saw it. A shape, tall and unmistakably human, standing just past the tree line, motionless, watching. The figure stood completely still, locked in place without a single visible movement or adjustment of posture. I blinked once, maybe twice, and the shape was gone. I stood there for another minute, maybe more, unsure of whether it had ever been there at all. I raised the mug and took a slow sip, letting the bitter taste of the coffee steady me. The fog began to lift in slow ribbons, pulling back across the landscape. I didn't say anything out loud. There was no one to speak to. But in the quiet, something about this place became clearer. Whatever lived in this stretch of wilderness, I wasn't alone with it. The morning air inside the tower was cool and dry, filtered through the narrow slats where the windows met the wood. The sky had a pale, bluish tone, and the light came in softly, brushing against the floorboards. I woke slowly, arms pinned to my sides by the rough wool blanket, and blinked at the ceiling. There was a stillness in the room that made it easy to forget where I was, until the sound of the fridge compressor kicked on and pulled me back into awareness. I sat up, letting the blanket fall, and reached for the small notebook by the bed to begin my day. I wrote the date, time, and weather conditions with care, documenting the cloud cover, the wind speed estimated by the motion of the treetops, and any wildlife I might have heard during the early hours. The act of writing settled my mind. With the page filled, I folded the book closed and began to prepare for the morning. The stove gave off a little heat, just enough to take the edge off the mountain air. I boiled water and made instant coffee, sipping it slowly by the window as I scanned the treetops. There were no sounds besides the wind. The radio was silent, and the sky was layered in gray. I remembered it was Thursday. That meant supplies. The thought carried a strange weight. It was one of the few signs of life outside this cabin, a small tether to the rest of the world. I stood near the window with the binoculars, sweeping the terrain with a practiced rhythm. It took some time, but eventually, just beyond the line where the hill dipped and trees thinned out, I spotted 3 crates arranged neatly on a flat piece of clearing. The crates rested in the clearing, perfectly aligned and undisturbed, with nothing in the surrounding trees or underbrush showing signs of movement or noise. I took my flashlight, stepped into my boots, and started the slow descent down the staircase. Each step gave a soft wooden groan. Once on the forest floor, the air smelled of pine and cold bark. The clearing stretched ahead through a shallow slope, surrounded on both sides by tall conifers that arched inward slightly. My boots pressed into the damp earth, leaving soft impressions in the mossy ground. The trail was not marked, but the lay of the land and the consistent space between tree clusters created a natural corridor leading directly to the spot I had seen from above. As I walked, I listened closely for anything unusual, any breaks in the rhythm of the forest. There were none. The only sounds were my steps and the rustle of needles beneath my feet. I passed a few boulders, half covered in moss, and sidestepped a narrow patch where water had gathered into a shallow puddle. A branch had broken off one of the trees and lay across the path. I nudged it aside and kept walking. The air grew heavier the closer I got to the crates, thick with the scent of old leaves and sap. When I finally reached them, I paused to scan the area again. Still nothing moved. The contents were practical and organized. Canned goods, vacuum-packed bread, dry rice, bottled water, batteries, and a few medical supplies. One box had a fresh bar of soap and a sealed bag of clean towels. Everything was clean, new, and intact. None of the boxes had been tampered with. I opened each one, checked the inventory against the note inside, then closed them and began to carry the items back to the tower in 3 trips. Inside, I lined up the supplies on the shelves. There was a comfort in this act, in arranging the jars and cans, in folding the towels and tucking them into a small wooden drawer. The space started to look lived in. Not warm, but functional. It felt more like a workspace now, less like a holding cell. I checked the time. Early afternoon. There was nothing else on the agenda. I spent some time sweeping the floor, organizing the books by spine color and thickness, and then rearranging the few tools and utensils on the kitchen counter. Afterward, I stood by the east-facing window, letting the late sunlight fall across my shirt. The woods outside remained still. No sound, but the breeze was brushing against the tower. Around 6 p.m., I prepared a simple dinner. Crackers, cheese, a few slices of sausage from one of the boxes, and a cup of lukewarm coffee. I ate slowly at the table. Then, as the sun started its descent, I glanced at the list on the refrigerator. The rules. Rule 1 reminded me, lights out by 10 p.m., no electronics after that. I got up, moved around the cabin, and unplugged what needed unplugging. I turned off the desk lamp, closed the book I was halfway through, and pulled the heavy curtain over the only west-facing window. I stood in front of the radio. Rule 7. Call the sister station before sleep. I flipped the switch, waited for the green light to settle. I pressed the button and spoke with clear diction. Sentinel Peak, Station 5. Checking in with sister station. Over. For a moment, I expected only static. I expected silence, or worse, interference that confirmed I was still entirely alone. My thumb hovered above the button, and I braced myself for nothing at all, until a voice crackled through the speaker. It wasn't sharp, but it was unmistakably clear. Copy that. Reading you clearly. Station 7 here. Weather report matches. All's quiet. Good night. I stared at the receiver a moment longer, feeling a quiet relief. The voice had been steady and mundane, human. It was the first time I had spoken to someone since arriving. A real voice that didn't come from inside my head. I replied with a brief, "Good night," and signed off. I turned off the unit and sat still for a moment, just listening to the silence fill back in. I got ready for bed the same way I had the night before, brushing my teeth over the small metal sink with bottled water, folding my clothes neatly over the chair, and sliding under the wool blanket. I left the flashlight within arm's reach, just in case. The wind had picked up slightly, brushing against the tower with more urgency. Sometime after midnight, I woke with a jolt, my body tense before my eyes had even adjusted to the dark. The air was dense and unmoving, the kind of silence that prickled at the skin. A dull thump echoed through the tower, followed by a stillness so thick it made the previous noise feel imagined. Then came 3 distinct knocks, each one short, sharp, and deliberate, striking the front door with calculated rhythm. The knocks came with purpose, not rushed or uncertain, but measured as if the one behind the door knew I would be listening. I pushed the blanket aside and sat upright, my breath caught halfway in my chest. My eyes scanned the room, slowly adjusting. Then the knocks came again, followed by a voice that was neither loud nor soft. It slipped through the cracks of the wood like a draft. "You forgot me." I froze. The tone was eerily calm, but that wasn't what made my skin crawl. The voice matched mine in every possible way, including tone, rhythm, and the slight rasp I heard only on recordings. It echoed my sound so precisely that any thought of coincidence vanished. This was not an imitation. It was exact in a way that made my chest tighten and my skin go cold. A knot of cold twisted in my gut. I remembered the rules, the list on the refrigerator, the one I'd almost laughed at my first night. Rule 3, no visitors. If someone knocks, speak through the door. If they mimic your voice, retreat and lock yourself in until dawn. I clenched the edge of the blanket and held my breath, waiting for it to speak again. The rule didn't mention what to do if the voice kept talking, only that I was to lock up and wait. I didn't call out. I didn't ask who it was. I just listened. The voice came again, quieter, like it had leaned in closer to the door. "I know you can hear me. I know what you're thinking." I stood, each muscle tense and strained, my limbs tight with the kind of dread that settled in the chest and made every step feel exposed. I moved slowly across the wooden floor, placing each foot down with care, not from instinct, but out of the deep fear that any noise might provoke something on the other side of the door. I reached the kitchen and hesitated before touching the lock, afraid it might suddenly rattle or turn from the outside. My fingers trembled slightly as I tested it. Still latched. but the tension in my shoulders didn't ease. I grabbed the heavy chair, my hands clumsy with adrenaline, and dragged it into position. The legs scraped softly against the floor as I angled it beneath the knob, wedging it as tightly as I could. I stepped back slowly, not turning my back to the door. I backed away slowly and turned to face the windows. The darkness beyond them reflected only the faint outline of the cabin's interior. No shapes moved beyond the glass. The voice had gone silent. I sat at the table, flashlight off, and waited. Minutes felt like hours. I watched the black outside shift slowly to a deep gray. Nothing returned. The voice did not speak again, and the knocks did not repeat. Silence thickened in the room, heavy and suffocating. Eventually, the light of early morning bled across the horizon. I stood and made my way to the door, heart still thudding like it expected another sound. I opened it. The porch stood still in the early light. The grass around it remained undisturbed. There was not a single footprint, no disturbed blades of grass, and no indication that anything had crossed this ground. The surface held only dew and silence. I stared at it for a long while, and the memory of that voice at the door began to fray the edge of my composure. I thought about Rule 3, the way it had anticipated this exact moment. It wasn't just a precaution. It was a response to something known. Someone had written that rule knowing this thing, whatever it was, would come. That realization made the other rules feel heavier. Who wrote them? And what did they know that I didn't? Why the emphasis on isolation, on quiet, on limited contact? I began to suspect that each rule wasn't meant to keep me safe from the world outside, but to prepare me for something inside this place that I had yet to fully understand. I stepped outside, walked down a few steps, and looked up at the trees. They moved gently in the wind, their needles whispering to one another in the rising light. Everything looked the same. Yet inside me, the sense that I was truly alone had unraveled. I kept thinking about the voice that spoke with my exact tone, as if it had peeled it off me and worn it like skin. Who or what could have done that? And more importantly, how? That voice replicated mine so precisely that it erased any boundary between mimicry and identity. I couldn't make sense of it. The unease that had taken root the night before was no longer a passing chill. It was a growing awareness that this place felt remote at first, surrounded by distance and silence, but now it carried the weight of unseen observation. Known. And now I wondered if I was being studied, if that visitor had been part of a test. I needed to know what was watching from the dark and how it had learned to sound like me. Until I found the answer, I doubted I'd feel safe again. The air felt unusually dense when I opened my eyes, as if the room had thickened overnight. My body was stiff, not from cold, but from a fatigue that hadn't come from physical exertion. I sat up slowly, taking in the muted gray light filtering through the slats of the window. The stillness inside the tower was deeper than before, not silent, but loaded, like a held breath. I pulled on my sweatshirt and shuffled to the small desk, opening the weather log. My hands didn't shake exactly, but they didn't move smoothly either. I recorded the date and basic conditions, noting that the wind seemed unusually still for this altitude. Coffee didn't taste the same. I drank it anyway, standing by the window and trying to shake the sensation that something in the cabin had changed. The floor creaked in places it hadn't before. The light came in at a sharper angle. Outside, nothing moved, yet the forest felt watchful. I scanned the tree line with the binoculars and almost missed it, far to the northwest, a thin line of smoke rising through the trees, faint but unmistakable. I dropped the binoculars and moved quickly to the emergency phone. Rule 6. Only report visible wildfires. I grabbed the emergency phone, the plastic of the receiver cool and almost damp in my hand. I sat down, steadied my breath, and dialed the specific sequence pinned above the desk. Each number clicked louder than expected. When the line connected, there was no greeting. I spoke clearly and slowly, describing the location in relation to my tower's position, estimating the spread radius based on the smoke's thickness and noting the wind direction. My voice echoed slightly in the quiet room. After confirming I had nothing more to report, I ended the call, placed the receiver back on its cradle, and stared at it for a few long seconds, as if expecting it to ring. Roughly 20 seconds after hanging up, the shrill ring of the emergency phone shattered the stillness of the room. My hand hovered in hesitation, but I hadn't moved, hadn't touched the phone. It had connected on its own. I stood rooted in place, staring at the receiver as soft crackles leaked from the speaker. The static had a wet, underwater tone, like sound being dragged through something heavy. Then a voice emerged. At first it was disjointed, a distant mumble. Gradually, the sounds clarified into syllables that should have felt familiar. It said my name. It said it in a voice so identical to mine that for a moment I couldn't tell if it had come from the phone or my own throat. A cold shiver crawled up my spine. I didn't answer. I reached, slowly and deliberately, for the cloth that had been placed beside the phone for this exact reason. My fingers fumbled with the fabric before wrapping it tightly around the receiver. As soon as the cloth made contact, the voice stopped. It didn't trail off. It halted mid-syllable, like someone had pressed pause on a recording. The silence that followed was more than quiet, carrying a weight, as if the room itself was listening. Without looking back, I stepped away from the desk and walked out into the open air, hoping the pressure on my chest would ease under the sky. The mountain air burned in my lungs. The sun hadn't moved much. Maybe an hour had passed. I walked around the tower, checking for any sign of another presence. There was nothing, but the feeling didn't leave. I felt observed. Later that day, I decided I couldn't stay inside any longer. I needed to move, to be somewhere the walls weren't closing in. I left the tower and headed northeast, away from where the smoke had been. The terrain was uneven, the trail nearly non-existent. I used landmarks to guide me, a large split boulder, a tree stripped of bark, a stream that curved like a question mark. After walking for nearly a mile through uneven terrain and dense undergrowth, I came across a disturbing scene. The ground ahead of me had been torn apart in long, jagged grooves, as though something massive had been dragged forcefully across it. These marks were not random. They formed a deliberate path that cut deep into the earth, lined with clumps of disturbed soil. I stepped closer, crouching to examine them. The grooves were irregular, some shallower than others, but they all seemed to be part of a continuous drag. The surrounding rocks were coated with a slick film, thick and gelatinous, the color of tarnished bronze. It glistened under the fading light, catching the last glow of the sun in oily smears. The smell rising from it was sharp and putrid, like copper soaked in something rotten. I recoiled slightly and pulled my shirt over my nose, but the odor clung to everything. Ahead, I noticed gaping holes in the ground, wide and circular, far too large to belong to any burrowing animal I knew. Their symmetry was unnerving. These weren't formed by natural erosion or even a landslide. They looked constructed, like they had a purpose. One of the burrows was half concealed behind a cluster of brambles. I hesitated, but curiosity drove me forward. I parted the thorny branches and ducked inside. The tunnel sloped gradually downward. Each step took me further from natural light. The walls, slick with moisture, narrowed as I went deeper. The air turned stale and thick, and the smell of that strange fluid was stronger here. The ground beneath my boots was sticky, as if I were walking on layers of half-dried glue. Every step made a soft, peeling sound. I tried to measure how far I'd gone by counting seconds under my breath. 5 minutes passed. Maybe more. I stopped, suddenly aware of how distant the surface felt. The air was more than stale, carrying a heavy weight, as if pressing inward. My skin was clammy. I reached for my watch, pressed the light button, and squinted at the glowing numbers. 10:02 p.m. The realization struck like a physical blow. My stomach turned. I had lost track of time, and I was deep underground with no lights out, violating one of the first rules I had been given. Panic surged through me as I spun around and began to move quickly back the way I had come. 10:02 p.m. I turned and ran. The trail back twisted into something unfamiliar. Trees that had felt like landmarks now crowded close with warped shadows stretching in unnatural angles. When I finally broke through the tree line, I stopped short. The tower stood under a sky that had gone completely dark. When I'd entered the tunnel, there had still been traces of daylight. Now, the only light came from the windows of the cabin, still fully lit. I sprinted up the stairs, 2 at a time, breath ragged in my throat. Inside, I flipped the switches quickly, each one making a sharp snap as the bulbs extinguished. The space dropped into thick shadow. I leaned against the wall, chest heaving, eyes adjusting slowly. My mouth was dry, my arms trembling with the shock of how much time had vanished without my noticing. I sat in the darkness, heart pounding, ears tuned to every creak. The first jolt hit so hard that the lantern on the shelf tipped and clattered to the floor. I grabbed the edge of the desk to steady myself as a deep, growling vibration passed up through the floorboards and into my legs. It wasn't thunder. The sound came from underneath, beneath the stone and wood, from the earth cradling the tower's base. Something immense had pressed against the structure. A long pause followed. Then another impact, slower and more deliberate, as if it were feeling for weakness. The walls groaned. I could hear the bolts in the frame shift slightly, creaking like old bones under pressure. Dust drifted from the ceiling as the floor swayed minutely, just enough to send my heartbeat racing. I backed away from the center of the room, pressing myself into the far corner beside the footlocker. My hands clenched around my knees, breath shallow and quiet. Outside, the wind surged with a harsh, scraping sound, dragging tree limbs across the roof with a force that made the walls tremble. The shaking stopped, but the air remained heavy, charged with a threat that hadn't passed. I stayed there, unmoving, eyes fixed on the floor, waiting for something else to come. It didn't. Not right away. The shaking finally stopped, and I stood in the silence, still pressed to the corner. My breathing slowed, but my limbs stayed tight with tension. I pushed myself to stand and crossed to the desk, routine pulling me forward like a lifeline. Rule 7. Contact the sister station before sleep. I switched on the radio and adjusted the dial until the static smoothed into silence. Station 5 to Station 7. Do you read? The reply came through without pause, like someone had been waiting with their finger on the button. I read. Do you regret it? The words were wrong, but the voice was unmistakable. It matched mine perfectly in every detail and tone. The same tone, the same cadence, the same slight rasp at the end of sentences. Hearing it was like standing outside my own body. I stared at the radio, trying to process what I had just heard. My hand hovered above the dial, but I didn't touch it. My breath caught, shallow and loud in the quiet room. My mind replayed the moment I noticed the time underground. I hadn't just broken a rule, I had shattered it. I didn't know what I expected when I turned the light off late, but I hadn't expected a copy of my own voice to greet me. The implications rolled over me in waves. If that voice was mine, who was speaking? And how? A thought formed, slow and cold, dragging itself from the back of my mind. I left the lights on too long. This is my fault. I reached forward and turned the radio off without saying anything more. The silence afterward didn't feel like relief. It felt like waiting. I sat in the dark with my arms wrapped around myself, listening to the wind claw against the windows, unsure if it was truly the wind or something else that had noticed my mistake. Light seeped into the tower through the narrow gaps in the shutters, casting thin golden lines across the wooden floor. I rose slowly, my limbs stiff from the restless night. As I opened the door, a muted breeze touched my face. The trees stood silent, their branches unmoving, the sky an overcast gray. I scanned the base of the tower. There it was, the same viscous residue stretched across the legs of the structure, dried in some areas, fresh and glistening in others. Back inside, I tried to focus. I splashed cold water on my face and let it run down my neck. I scrubbed the counter with a damp cloth, although there was little to clean. I sat at the desk and wrote a few lines in my field journal, forcing the pen forward even when I had nothing new to add. Each action was mechanical, meant to disguise the discomfort that settled deeper with every hour I spent trying to explain what I had seen. The residue outside hadn't faded. It clung to the beams as if it had been freshly applied. Something had come during the night and left another message. The trail of residue extended beyond the tower's perimeter. It led off into the trees to the northeast, in long smears along roots and rocks. I packed a flashlight, canteen, and my field journal. Following that trail felt like the only choice I had left. The forest was unusually quiet. The forest was silent. The usual birdsong had faded and no branches swayed or cracked. The only sound was the crunch of my boots over the brittle underbrush. The deeper I went, the thicker the atmosphere grew. Trees loomed taller here, their trunks marked with long, thin scratches, spaced at irregular intervals. Now and then, I'd spot another smear of the residue on a branch or embedded in the soil. The trail curved slightly, and I recognized the slope. It was the path toward the sister tower. The marks were guiding me there. The final stretch of the trail straightened out, revealing the familiar silhouette of the lookout against the pale sky. I approached carefully, glancing up at the windows. No movement. The door hung open slightly, swaying gently in the breeze. Inside, the station was cold. There was no warmth from a fire, and no signs that anyone had been here recently. The air smelled stale and chemical, like an old storage room locked for years. I called out, listening to my voice echo against the wooden walls. Nothing answered. The workstation sat untouched. The bed was neatly made. The chair by the desk had been pushed back, as if someone had stood abruptly and never returned. The same viscous residue had pooled around the legs of the bed. Thin streaks of it stained the desk's corners. One of the radios emitted a low-frequency static, its pitch unpleasant and broken. I stood motionless in the center of the room. No journal entries, no food, no gear missing. Whoever had lived here had not left by choice. Everything suggested a sudden disappearance, complete and unplanned. A tightness formed in my chest. My throat felt dry. This was my fault. I had forgotten the light. I had let time slip past while crawling through filth and tunnels, chasing shadows instead of following rules. The voice I heard the night before, the mimicry of my own, the silent response over the radio, maybe that had been my warning. Maybe if I had shut the light, if I had followed the procedure exactly as written, the other station would still be occupied. Maybe the same residue wouldn't be beneath my tower. Maybe I wouldn't be staring into the ghost of a life that had vanished because I couldn't keep track of time. The walk back stretched into what felt like an unending trail. My legs moved with urgency, but every step seemed to echo louder than it should, as if the forest were holding its breath. The trees rose around me, silent and still, each one a sentinel watching without blinking. I kept glancing back, not because I saw anything specific, but because I couldn't shake the weight of being followed. When I finally emerged into the clearing, the sight of my tower brought little relief. I approached with measured steps, eyes scanning the windows and the rooftop. The door creaked as I opened it, and I paused on the threshold, waiting for something to move or shift inside. I climbed the stairs with slow, deliberate steps. Each board groaned beneath my boots. At the top, I stepped into the cabin and looked around. Nothing had been moved. The notebooks were stacked as I had left them. The chair sat neatly tucked under the table. But when my gaze landed on the wall-mounted clock, my breath caught. The second hand was frozen. A faint tick hung in the air, unfinished. I pulled up my sleeve and stared at my wristwatch. The hands were motionless. I walked quickly to the bedside and picked up the small travel clock. It was completely silent, its red digits dead. Every clock in the tower had stopped at once. Rule 4. I hurried to the safe beneath the desk, pulling back the rug that concealed it. My fingers punched in the code 8913, and I turned the latch. Inside the safe was a silver stopwatch resting on deep red velvet. It was the size of my palm, with a smooth, rounded case that gleamed in the dim light. The face was an aged cream color, and the hands were thin and jet black, almost elegant in their design. The top had a small, ridged knob, its texture catching under my fingers as I picked it up. It was cold and unexpectedly heavy, denser than I had anticipated, like it held more than just gears inside. The glass covering the face was unblemished, not a single scratch or crack. I turned the knob gently. The winding motion was firm, with a resistance that clicked into place. Immediately, the ticking began. It was not faint or soft. Each tick landed with precision, metallic and sharp, like a fine-tuned mechanism that had been waiting for years to be touched again. The air inside the tower shifted. It felt as though the pressure had dropped. The cold crept in, a cold presence in the air, brushing against my skin and crawling across my scalp. The rule echoed in my mind. I stepped back from the window and forced my gaze downward. My eyes fixed on a warped knot in the wooden floor. The ticking slowed. Each sound stretched farther apart, as if time itself was drawing out with every beat. Then, without warning, it stopped. A sensation passed through the room like the tail end of an earthquake. My ears popped. The dust in the corners of the ceiling trembled. I remained still, counting my breaths. As I lifted my gaze from the floor, a strange heaviness settled in my chest. The light spilling through the windows looked different. The sun had shifted too far west. Shadows that should have stretched long and thin now huddled close to the base of the trees. The color of the sky leaned toward a bruised late-afternoon gray. I knew the timing was wrong. I turned and walked briskly toward the sink where the calendar hung. My eyes snapped to the page. The red square I had carefully drawn around Saturday was missing. In its place, the square now surrounded on Sunday. An entire day had disappeared. I hadn't dreamed. I hadn't imagined the clock stopping. Something had pulled me forward through time. I stood there for a long moment, trying to make sense of what had just happened. A tight coil wound in my gut. The stopwatch had changed something real. Rule 4 had warned of this, but now another rule loomed larger. Rule 5. I crossed to the desk where the radio log book lay. The date aligned with what the calendar now showed. Sunday, the day I was required to send in the week's transmissions. My hand hovered over the main unit before I forced it to move. I flipped the switch. The green indicator light flickered, slow and faint at first, then steady. The speakers hissed, the sound uneven. I leaned closer. The hiss cracked and grew into a familiar shape. A voice emerged, firm and paced. It was my own. I stayed completely still, shoulders tightening as I recognized the exact cadence I used when reporting in. The rhythm, the breath between words, it was identical. But there was no microphone in my hand and no memory in my mind of saying any of it. The voice continued, describing an incident with complete composure, as though it were being read from a prepared report. But the last sentence was wrong. It described something I had never seen. A forest fire that consumed both towers and left no survivors. The tone in my voice was calm and collected, like I knew it would happen. My own report, but from a time or place I couldn't recall. I leaned closer, eyes wide, breath shallow, listening to myself speak about things I had no recollection of. My hands gripped the edge of the desk, knuckles white. Each word hit like a cold drop down my spine. The voice had knowledge I didn't. It narrated details of a fire I hadn't seen, damage I hadn't assessed, and a tone of finality that felt rehearsed. Something was wrong, deeply and structurally wrong. I couldn't look away from the unit, yet everything in me screamed to shut it off. But I needed to hear how it ended. Then, the voice stopped. Static returned, soft and indifferent, like it had never been interrupted. My skin prickled. I stepped back, heart thudding in my chest. This wasn't a mistake or a misfiled recording. I had just heard a version of myself deliver a warning I never gave. I stumbled back from the radio and remembered the rule. If your recorded voice plays unexpectedly, bury the radio unit 10 inches deep. I unplugged the entire console, pulled it free from the mounting brackets, and bundled the cords together. I carried it down the stairs, out into the forest, stopping only when I reached a clearing with soft soil. I dropped to my knees, scraped away the leaves, and started digging with my hands. The dirt was cold, clinging to my nails and skin. I dug until the hole was deep enough, then placed the unit inside and began covering it with soil. My hands were trembling, but I kept going until the ground was smooth again. I stood there, staring at the patch of disturbed earth. The voice had spoken too clearly. The prediction had been too precise, and I wasn't sure if I had just buried a machine or something else. That night, I didn't touch the radio. I didn't turn the dials. I didn't call out to the sister station. I knew no one would answer. The silence of that empty room echoed in my memory, and I couldn't bear to face that hollow confirmation again. But I couldn't sit still either. I kept pacing the floor, pausing to glance at the calendar, at the empty chair, at the now buried radio. My thoughts turned over the last words of that recording. The fire, the destruction, the finality. I remembered that report. It had been mine, somehow. That meant it came from a future I hadn't lived yet, or one I was being forced into. And if it mentioned the fire, that meant the fire was still coming. Was it the same fire I had reported to HQ? The one I'd seen smoldering days ago, far off beyond the ridge? I tried to recall its location, its direction, whether it had grown or stayed low. My heart pounded harder. I wondered if I had triggered it, or if it had always been meant to come. I sat by the cold window and stared out at the trees. Somewhere out there, in the maze of roots and residue, lay the answer. The stopwatch, the rules, the mimicry, the recordings, all of it pointed to a trap. And if there was a trap, then maybe there was also a way out. That night, I made a decision. I would find a way to escape this tower. I would learn what was orchestrating this pattern, and I would find out if the fire in that report had already begun to burn. Chapter 5. The forest had begun to feel like a rotating maze. I couldn't tell how many days had passed, not truly. The stopwatch had shattered any confidence I had in time. And now, after the broadcast, the voice, the fire report I never made, I found myself staring out the window, unable to determine what was real anymore. Nothing in the tower had changed, but everything felt wrong. The residue, the vanished colleague, the tape of my own voice. They swirled together like parts of a dream I was forced to live inside. My reflection in the window looked unfamiliar. My eyes were too wide, my hands too still. Something inside me had shifted. I couldn't stay inside. I had to find answers. If these things, these creatures, had left their mark around both towers, they had to be somewhere close. I packed light, my flashlight, extra flares, the field knife, and the bottle of water I'd been saving. I began patrolling the nearby forest, heading north, then curling east. My boots pressed into soil still damp from last night's rain, and the scent of mold clung to the air. The deeper I went, the more residue I found. Some of it was smeared high across tree bark, glistening in the filtered daylight like oil. Some of it congealed around burrows and hollow logs, seeping into the earth. Once, I thought I spotted a dragging trail that disappeared into a thicket of low branches. I followed it cautiously, heart hammering, but it thinned and vanished before I could locate an endpoint. I paused beside a tree coated in a sheet of the stuff and crouched low to examine it. It glimmered faintly, almost pulsing, as though alive. I asked myself what kind of living thing could produce something so viscous and unnatural. No bear or wolf would leave behind a secretion like this. It wasn't waste or blood. It was something else. A secretion tied to territory, maybe communication. Whatever was left, it had intelligence, an intention behind its movement. And if that was true, then it was watching too. The wind shifted. That's when I caught the smell. Acrid and thick. Smoke. I turned toward it instinctively. The smell thickened quickly. It filled my nostrils, acrid and bitter, gaining strength with every step by the second. I climbed a ridge that overlooked the southern tree line, expecting to see a stray plume in the distance. But what I saw stole the breath from my lungs. Flames danced high against the skyline. My tower was on fire, the sister station too. Columns of smoke rose in thick spirals, orange reflecting in their haze. I stumbled forward a few steps, unable to process what I was seeing. From my vantage point, I watched as dark shapes leapt from the collapsing balconies. They climbed down in rapid succession. Dozens of figures, dark and fluid in their motion, descended from the burning structures with a purpose that chilled me. They couldn't be human. Their limbs stretched in unnatural proportions, and their movements carried a speed no person could match. Their bodies shimmered with a texture that matched the residue I had seen for days. These creatures were the ones responsible for everything. The markings on the trees, the streaks on the towers, the imitation of voices through the radio. Panic overrode every thought. I turned and ran, weaving between trees, ducking under branches, splashing through shallow creeks. I didn't stop until my lungs screamed and my legs felt unsteady. I remembered the Monday supply drops. They were consistent, always left in the same spot in the clearing beyond the northern ridge. If I could get there, if the contents were anything useful, then maybe I still had a chance to act before those things returned. I moved through the underbrush, branches clawing at my sleeves, my breath shallow and sharp. When I reached the edge of the meadow, I saw them. 3 weather-worn crates placed neatly on a pallet, same as they always had been. It was almost surreal to see them untouched, as if the chaos had passed this place by entirely. I approached the first crate and opened it with a pry of the lid. Inside were basic supplies, a few cans of beans, a replacement flashlight battery, and a folded shirt that smelled faintly of bleach. I tossed them aside quickly and moved on to the second crate. This one felt heavier. I pried it open with more force. Inside, I found 2 emergency flares and a rust-marked metal container. I recognized the shape immediately. It was a gas canister. Full. My grip tightened around the handle, the cool steel grounding me in the moment. My fear hadn't vanished, but now it had form. It had direction. If those things had taken my station, then I would take something from them. I wasn't going to end like the last ranger. I wasn't going to lie alone and bleeding on a mattress, reduced to a rumor passed between transport drivers. I had a plan, and I would carry it out. With a tight grip on the canister, I moved toward the northeast caves. I had passed them days ago, open mouths in the hillside, slick with moss and decay. As I neared, I dropped low and crawled between tall grass and stones. That's when I saw them again. 3 of them stood just outside the cavern's mouth. I could see the details clearly now. The uneven, stuttering way their joints moved, the small jerks in their shoulders like muscles weren't aligned properly beneath the surface. Their limbs twitched constantly, as if resisting gravity, and their heads angled too far to the side, bones flexing in ways that didn't seem possible. Their skin wasn't fully solid. Patches shimmered, thin and pale, as if the residue I had been tracking hadn't just been left behind by them, but was them, malleable, slick, semi-formed. I crouched behind a cluster of stones, barely breathing, aware of every heartbeat and the sweat slipping down my back. Seeing them this close stripped away the distance I had kept until now. These were not shadows in the trees. They were real, and they were watching the world in silence, waiting. I held my breath, remaining perfectly still until they moved back inside. Careful not to make a sound, I checked the surroundings once more and ensured my gear was tight and silent. I did not know how sensitive their senses were or how quickly they could react. Each movement had to be deliberate. With heart pounding and breath held, I began to move. I stepped where the underbrush was softest, crept low where shadows gathered thickest, and followed their path into the cave, determined to remain unseen for as long as I could. The cave air was damp and thick. Every footstep echoed. I dripped gasoline as I went, watching it soak into the rocky floor. The passage twisted and deepened. I reached a central chamber, a wide hollow with dozens of small tunnels branching outward. This chamber, lined with slick walls and saturated air, marked the center of everything I had been tracing. The residue was denser here, pooled in viscous clumps that clung to the stone and glowed faintly in the dark. The scattered fragments of organic material, bones, torn fabric, and something that resembled fingernails made it clear this wasn't just a resting place. It was a hive, a center of movement and instinct. This was their nest, the origin of every trail, every whisper, every grotesque echo that had followed me through the forest. I emptied the remaining fuel in a circle around the center. I took out a flare and crept backward, retracing my steps to the entrance. I waited, heartbeat drumming in my ears, muscles clenched. They returned minutes later. I saw the flicker of their movement at the edge of the dark. I struck the flare, and the red flame burst to life with a hiss that lit up the cavern in flickering crimson. Holding it firm, I felt the heat lick my fingers as I drew my arm back and hurled it with every ounce of strength I had into the depths of the nest. The flare spun through the darkness before vanishing into the gloom, and then everything changed. A sound erupted, a forceful reaction from deep within the tunnel. The fire ignited, and a resonance surged outward, an ancient force reacting to the intrusion. A scream followed, not in any human language, but unmistakably a cry of awareness and fury, all the same. It came from the walls, the floor, from deep within the tunnels. It surged through my chest and made my vision blur. The air vibrated with the frequency of something enraged and alive. A flash of heat slammed outward. Flames roared through the passageway like a living tide. Smoke, thick and bitter, clawed at my face. I turned and ran, my boots slipping on ash-covered stone. Behind me, a roar grew louder as dirt and embers blasted outward, chasing me to the exit like the breath of a burning beast. The fire consumed the cave, and the heat surged into the forest, igniting its edges and stirring its hidden parts. The forest was catching now. Embers spread along dry leaves and branches. I ran toward the old bridge, the one that brought me in. It groaned under my weight, but I didn't slow. On the other side, I turned back just once. Both towers were nothing but skeletons. Smoke poured from the cave mouth, and I felt something in my chest shift, a hollow certainty that the cycle had been broken. As I crossed the groaning bridge, I thought of the ranger before me, the one who had died in silence at the top of a lonely tower. This blaze was my escape, and also the reckoning he had been denied. I felt with a trembling finality that his story had found its ending through mine. I reached the main road by midday. My legs trembled with each step. My body was streaked with ash, and sweat had carved narrow paths through the grime on my face. I raised my arm, fingers extended as a pair of headlights emerged from the forest's curve. They shone too brightly. My eyes narrowed instinctively, and I lifted a hand to shield them. The vehicle slowed, its engine humming low and heavy. It was a Jeep, the same model that had taken me up the mountain days ago. Dust rose around it as it rolled to a stop, tires crunching over gravel. The driver's window eased down with a mechanical whir. Behind the wheel sat a man in a forest ranger's uniform. His face was in shadow at first, but then he leaned forward into the sunlight. It was him, the ranger who had brought me here. I took a step closer, breath catching, lips beginning to form a question. My thoughts scrambled for some explanation. He smiled, calm, familiar, and then he spoke, but it wasn't his voice that came out. It was mine. Need a ride? The forest behind me still burned, and I didn't know if I was leaving it behind, or if I had never left at all.